All right. So how's everybody? Everybody have water? Everybody have power? You obviously have power or you wouldn't be here. I'm sure the people who aren't here don't have power. You think that's it? Excuse me. Sorry. Wow. I'm going to try not to cough and sneeze too much, but I'm glad you have all the stuff you need. Um, yeah, I was a pioneer like the rest of you for a couple of days. So I was pulling down limbs from cedar trees and stuff. So I think if I wasn't allergic to cedar before, excuse me, that I am now. Oh dear. All right. Let's have a talk for a while. All right. So, wow, we've missed some time together. Now we need to figure out due dates. We do. I know I changed last week's due date to this Friday. Sorry for the yawn. But that gives you, sorry for the even bigger yawn, that gives you two things due this Friday. So I'll probably change the second due date to next Friday. Our problem is going to be, and we'll talk about it next week. I don't want to talk about it too much today. Our problem is going to be that week before spring break. Do you want to, I hate to extend all the extra, like, let's do a question and make it due after spring break. Um, And I don't think I really want to do the quiz for the unit after the spring break because I think maybe you'll forget stuff. Because I hope you're not spending a whole lot of time during spring break studying, although I think some of you probably work on the book review, just a thought. And we'll talk more about the book review in probably the week right before spring break. So not next week, but the week after. But, try to turn in something this Friday, whether it's last week's question or this week's question. I would go with probably last week's question if you haven't done that. And then, at least turn in one thing a week. If you didn't turn anything in last week, that's completely understandable. So just kind of assume the due dates are pushed back a week for a little while on the weekly questions. At some point, there's probably going to have to be two due at the same time. We'll have to figure out what point that is. And then next week, we'll talk about whether you want to push the quiz back past spring break or not. I don't think it's a great idea because I don't think you'll study over spring break and I think you might forget stuff. But if you think it's a great idea, I don't care. I don't care. I did put the study these things list up, and you may or may not have seen that. And I did, a couple of you emailed during the week off last week, the snow apocalypse, and said, I'm going to be late on my work. And, I put in announcements that said, don't worry about your work. And those go to your ACC email. And if you're not getting them for some reason, I think if you just check in the Blackboard every once in a while, they'll show up. Also had a couple more people ask if they could get feedback on the previous questions. And I promise you, I write stuff in the rubrics. So if you can go into your grade section, I think if you just click on the grade, you might be able to check the rubric. I'm pretty sure people have told me that it works that way. So, all right. So we're back to normal. That's good. It's good. So you're not at school and maybe your school doesn't leak. I hope your school doesn't leak. Now, I taught at Cedar Park High School. I taught on the end that overlooked the parking lot, student parking lot. That end leaks. At least it did. They may have fixed it by now. I'm just saying. So when you go to that end, watch out. Just watch out. All right. Let me see if I remember how to run a Zoom meeting. It's possible I don't. All right. Weekly question. Okay. All right. We have chat. Okay. Same chat. All right. But yeah, you guys check in with each other, see how everybody's doing. You guys probably kept up with each other a little though. All right. So question 5 for unit 2, question 1 for chapter 5. Compare relative advantages, of American and British militaries. How was George Washington able to secure a victory over the most powerful nation in the world? Now, you may or may not have noticed that I did make a little separate video last week and should have put the link to it or something in Blackboard that was just about that weekly question. So you can go back and review that. I'm not saying we're not going to talk about it. We are. Don't get upset. And there's quite a bit in the notes about that as well. And then the next question for the chapter we're supposed to cover today, but probably won't get to: how did women react to the language of freedom and liberty? Be sure to include in your response. Goodness, Abigail Adams' opinion that appeared in Voices of Freedom. So that's that little section in your book. And there's also a really famous letter that got published that she wrote to her husband. And the quote is, "Remember the ladies." So she talks about how when they're making the Constitution, that women also deserve rights, that kind of thing as well. I've graded a couple. I know, because a couple of you did stuff. If you turned it in early and you don't like your grade, you can redo it. It's completely fine. Excuse me on this one. So sorry. And things that I noticed is people just listing stuff or listing people and not explaining who they are. So you don't have to tell me who George Washington was, and you don't have to tell me who Abigail Adams was. But if you mention other people, if you mention Judith Sargent Murray, or if you mention somebody who's not as famous, at least just put a little parentheses like colonial education expert, or major general for the colonial military. Just in a little parentheses, explain who people are. And somebody in the number 6 question said, women began to embrace the idea of Republican motherhood. I'm like, okay, if you're going to say that, you have to explain what Republican motherhood is, right? You have to. Don't be like that. All right. So let's look at the notes. For the American Revolution chapter, some more people came in. Should we just tell them it's too late? Let's do it. Too late. Oh, goodness. Let me write them down. Maybe. Oh, we're almost full. No, my internet has been a little iffy here as well. So if I end up leaving, you guys just keep talking. So, all right. Let me go to the notes. And yeah, these notes are weird. I don't know who made these. Must have been me, right? Okay, so last we talked French and Indian War, 7 Years War, which lasted about 7 years. Yeah, about 7 years. And the goal, you remember, maybe, probably not, Lord North said, you know what, it's time to kick the French out. We can control the whole region and capitalize on the trade of that region. Goodness. Oh, sorry. Wow. Okay. So, Lord North, we're going to spend whatever it takes. And oh my goodness, we're in a situation like that in the United States right now, too. So, whenever you hear politicians like, we're going to spend whatever it takes, or I'm not worried about if it's too big, I'm worried about if it's too small, and we're going to get answers, or we're going to fix the electric reliability system, that probably means somebody's about to spend some money. So that's what happened here. And if you're a politician, you might be someday, maybe, I don't know. We need politicians, of course, so I hope that you are, but what a job. They usually like to get reelected. That seems to be their main goal in life, or to help people. Politicians usually more locally really do want to help people. I'm sure they do nationally as well, but these politicians wanted to get reelected, and the best thing to do when you want to get reelected is to figure out, what can I do to solve a problem that will upset the least number of people, or will only upset the people who are least likely to vote? Yes, least likely to vote, so that in the next election, they don't go out and kick the bum out of office. So in this situation, to pay for the French and Indian War, the best solution for politicians was, hey, let's make the colonists pay for it because they don't vote. They don't vote. Yeah. Now, you may have been taught in 8th grade history that colonists rebelled because the taxes were unfair. And that was certainly their perspective. I'm not arguing that that was an incorrect teaching. It of course isn't. Colonists did think the taxes were unfair. However, colonists didn't pay very much in taxes compared to what people back in England paid. So the people in England didn't have a lot of sympathy for the colonists when these taxes were levied on the colonists. They said, you know what, it's about time you guys paid what you were supposed to pay. Because by and large, can we say that? Overall, whatever phrase, people who lived in the colonies had a better standard of living than people who lived in England. So they were wealthier. So this was almost like having the rich pay their fair share. So, and I know that not the colonists weren't necessarily rich, but by those standards of that day, they were better off. They had the opportunity to own land, and urban poverty had really become a thing in England, especially in London, of course. So not a lot of sympathy for the colonists. All right. So that's kind of the backdrop of what's going on. Big debt. Politicians in England have to cover the debt, and they want to cover the debt in the way that's least likely to impact them or the constituents who favor them. So they want to pay off the debt but still get reelected. Yeah, and that's tricky. Yeah. So asking the colonists to pay the debt is good because colonists don't vote. So that'll lead us to talk about virtual and actual representation and a whole bunch of stuff, which apparently I didn't feel like making a lot of notes about. I just listed. So here we are. All right. So American colonists did see themselves as patriots at the end of the French and Indian War. And their thought was, we have done more to advance the British Empire than almost anyone in history, because here we are living in the wilderness. Of course, some of the cities definitely weren't wilderness, but we're living on the edge of the empire, and we're willing to die, to fight and spill our own blood and sacrifice our lives to expand the British Empire. And the way that the British began to see this was a bunch of spoiled colonists, get to do whatever they want, live in the lap of luxury, and they can't even protect themselves. So we have to send this very expensive military over because they had to cross the ocean and bring the stuff. They also hired some Hessians. Those were the German for hire troops. Oh, goodness, I'm so sorry. So the British had incurred a lot of debt. Plus, now that they own more land, they've got to leave some troops there to protect that land, and that's going to be expensive as well. So the expense of the war was big, but also the expense of the standing army that had to remain to protect the territory was also a big concern to them. That's why they issued the Proclamation of 1763, because they really didn't have a great desire to fight with Native Americans. They had a great desire to trade with Native Americans, because now that the French were gone, that's who else could they trade with? So they were going to have a trading monopoly. They were super excited about that. So they really didn't want to upset the Native Americans. Now, American colonists or British American colonists thought, woohoo, now we can go grab more land. And that is going to naturally cause some conflict with the Native Americans. So we're at a little bit of an impasse here in 1763 at the end of the war. Now, so the British are going to try to solve the economic issue by levying a series of taxes. One of the things, excuse me, that you would notice is that every time the British levied a tax, the Americans would fight back. They would disagree with the tax, and they would usually not pay it, have a boycott of British made goods, harass the tax collectors, that sort of stuff. And the book talks about several instances of that. So Yeah. Um, Thomas, oh yeah, they would ransack colonial British authorities' houses. They would hang people in effigy. Effigy is like a, we don't do that so much now. I think you see similar stuff overseas. We don't, I don't think we do this here in the United States, but you guys can correct me. But in the modern era, what we would do is like if you were mad at Donald Trump or you were mad at Joe Biden, you would get a picture of Donald Trump or Joe Biden and you would hold it up and set it on fire. Hanging someone in effigy is it's more work. So you get like you would make a Donald Trump doll. Although, do you remember Donald Trump piñatas? That was kind of thing. But you would get a Donald Trump doll, or you would get a Joe Biden doll, and then you would go in the courtyard like at Cedar Park High School. Don't do this, and get a rope and hang the Joe Biden doll by the neck or something. So that's hanging in effigy. And they did that quite a bit during this time period. They also tarred and feathered. You may remember that from your 8th grade years. And the tar is warm enough that it would singe your skin but wouldn't kill you. And then the feathers would attach to the tar. And apparently that was painful, but the most painful part was getting the tar off your skin. So, I mean, that could eventually be deadly because if you got an infection, yeah, all over your skin, that would be pretty awful. So, people didn't want to be tax collectors, is kind of how this works. So, they end up sending in the military to help collect taxes. So, the British will levy a tax, the colonists will react against the tax, they'll reject the tax, they'll work against it, they'll protest it, they'll boycott it. Then the British will take the tax away. And then the British will go, we're going to try this tax. And then you'll see that same cycle over and over and over. And the first tax, I can't remember if your book has a tax chart. God, when I taught in high school, I used to have a lovely tax chart. I wonder if I still have it somewhere. But it listed all the taxes and the colonial responses. That was a really good tax chart. Darn, I'll have to look for that. You're going like, why does she care about the tax chart? But it really just showed that every time there was a tax levy, the British responded. So, you noticed probably already at the beginning of each chapter, you could just look at the chronology. So for this chapter, it's on page 182. So the Sugar Act is the first tax, and it's on sugar. I mean, that's why they called it the Sugar Act. And most people didn't eat sugar back then. It's not like it is now where sugar's kind of cheap, so you can afford it. Back then, sugar was a luxury, so it was really expensive. So when they levied this additional tax on sugar, the thought was, this only affects the wealthiest people, so people won't mind about that. And they did. People did mind about that. And the book also, as I'm kind of peeking at it, reminds you that the debt that they incurred from this war was substantial. It mentions that if you did it in today's dollars, it would be 10 trillion. So it would be more than we have spent in our country developing the vaccine, COVID relief checks, all that kind of stuff. It's more than our current national debt. So it is a ridiculous amount of money. So it really was a serious thing. But the Sugar Act didn't have the effect that they expected. They thought, that people would not protest it, and then people did. Yeah. And the Sugar Act also, in addition to levying the taxes on sugar, it created vice admiralty courts. So it got rid of the idea of trial by jury. So because if you had trial by jury and you didn't pay, or local trial by jury, you didn't pay your taxes and you ended up going to court over this, other colonists would go like, good job. They wouldn't care that you didn't pay your taxes. So a vice admiralty court meant that when you went to court for not paying your taxes, that your jury was a bunch of military guys or guys, excuse me, who were from England, and they really resented that you wouldn't pay your taxes. So when the British repealed the Stamp Act, or excuse me, the Sugar Act, they thought, you know what we'll do? Instead, we'll do a little tax on everyone. Surely they won't mind that. They'll see that as more fair. And that created an amazing response. They ended up with the Stamp Act Congress and lots of protests and boycotts. And the idea that starts to develop early, I mean, even, when the Sugar Act is imposed, is that it's not fair to tax someone if they're not properly represented. So you start to hear that phrase, taxation without representation. And that's when you start to see the discussion of virtual versus actual representation. So here's how virtual, I don't even have to explain this to you because you've done a year of virtual education potentially. You know the difference. Virtual representation for taxes, I mean, at least you have a new perspective on this, would be, it's kind of the way that you guys are represented in Congress if you're not 18. If you're 18, you're represented directly because you can vote. If you're not 18, or if you haven't voted, you're represented virtually because you don't vote, but these people still act on your behalf. So what the English would argue was that people in the colonies did have representation because there's somebody appointed in Congress to represent them, and they're supposed to represent their best interests. Now, that person who's appointed in Congress to represent them probably has never even been to the colonies, just some other rich guy from London, and he's just going to operate in his own best interest. I mean, that's the way that's going to work. So the colonists would argue this virtual representation is crap because the guy who represents us doesn't even speak to us. He's never even seen us. He's never been here. He doesn't live the way we live. So he's just doing what he thinks is best, probably for him, not for us. So they want actual representation. They want people to be elected and to represent them. And that's just not going to happen. There's going to be some discussion of that in Parliament. And the Parliament is not going to be overly sympathetic to the British colonists, but they will be slightly sympathetic in some quarters. There'll be some people who say, like, no, that does kind of make sense. But the people in England who felt that way were very much in the minority, very much. Okay. The book talks about many instances where people who tried to enforce taxes got bad things happened to them. Their houses got ransacked. People made dolls of them and, did the hanging and effigy sort of thing. So the book has lots of examples of that. So be sure and look at that. The protest to the Stamp Act ended up with a committee of correspondence, so that the different colonies could communicate with each other about how they were rejecting the taxes. The Sons of Liberty were created after during the Stamp Act crisis, and they were kind of like we'll go with protesters, but they were more than protesters because they occasionally would dump tea later on into the water, that sort of thing. They also, in the country, you had guys who were sort of like Sons of Liberty called regulators. But these guys felt like they were even less represented because they lived out on the frontier, and they felt like even the wealthier people within their own colony ignored them. So you'll see some discussion of that. Now, after the Stamp Act is repealed, then the British decide to levy the Townshend duties, or the Townshend Acts. And this is a series of different taxes on different items that people used. And they thought, well, if we have this grab bag of taxes, again, that'll be less offensive. It's not just one tax on stamps, which, as you already probably remember from your previous US history courses, wasn't just on stamps. It was on any legal document. They decided they would tax goods, that sort of thing, and limit certain goods as well. And that spurred a really big boycott. So then people said, you know what? we're not going to buy your stuff anymore. We'll make our own. So it had this homespun movement, and the Daughters of Liberty, started weaving their own cloth. And I don't know that they made their own furniture. I don't know what they did, but they did definitely weave their own cloth, and they had non-importation groups, which is boycotting. So not buying stuff from England. So then the British said, you know what? We will get rid of some of these taxes as well, except for one. We'll keep the one that's probably going to make us the most money potentially, and that's the Tea Act. Well, you know how that went over. So there's a little protest of that where they dump a little bit of tea, or about $4 million worth, into the Boston Harbor. And then the British go like, we're not putting up with this foolishness from you people anymore. And they pass the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. Oh, sorry. And sorry, drink. Oh. This Coercive or Intolerable Act, I feel like I forgot to say something important. We'll just go on with the Coercive or Intolerable Act. The Tea Act, you know about the Tea Act probably from 8th grade, but part of the deal with the Tea Act was to support the East India Tea Company and create a monopoly for that. And people were used to kind of smuggling the tea if they didn't like the price of the British tea. So this created a system where they would enforce the taxes more at the major harbors. They made it harder to smuggle the tea. So that's part of the frustration with this as well. So when they dump all the tea in the harbor, it's not just that, it's a lot of things. It's not that they're angry at the East India Tea Company, or they don't really like monopolies. Nobody really cared about monopolies at that point. They just didn't like the fact that these taxes were being enforced and they couldn't smuggle. They were not getting to do things the way they used to do them. So intolerable acts were after the Tea Party, and that was to punish, or coercive act, that was to punish the colony of Massachusetts and force them to pay for the tea. And the thought that the British had with this act was, if we punish, we shut down the harbor, make them pay the millions of dollars for the tea. If we do this, then no other colony, no other group is going to act like this. And instead, it started to bring some colonial unity. So the other colonies started supporting Massachusetts, and it really turns into something that they didn't expect. So one of the responses to the Intolerable Acts was the Colonial Congress Continental Congress created the Continental Association to arrange things and even at this point, and we're talking 1774, 1773, 1774, they haven't necessarily said we're out of here. Their thought is, we're going to send people to England to argue Enlightenment principles of no taxation without representation, except occasionally Patrick Henry would say, give me liberty or give me death. But even at that point, people said, hey, that's a little too much right now. But, the American colonists were arguing that this taxation was unfair for philosophical purposes. Now, anybody who's got time to argue that taxation is unfair for philosophical purposes probably is a wealthy person. And one of the things that is unusual about the American Revolution is it is initiated and kind of led in part by people who are wealthier. Usually people who have a lot of money don't rebel and go like, this system doesn't work for us, let's blow it up. These guys are a little different, as you may have noticed. Now, before we declare independence, we start fighting. So that's probably a sign of where we're headed. And the book talks about the different battles that occur, Lexington and Concord, which is kind of the warm up, and then Bunker Hill, which is the first official battle. Now, the Second Continental Congress will organize the army, print money to pay the army, and that money may or may not be worth much, not worth much. And The first really important act is to put George Washington in charge as the commander of the Continental Army. And other people, oh my goodness, I gotta turn my phone over. Other people will be appointed beneath George Washington. But one thing that I would urge you to remember as you answer the weekly question is that we did have a formal army. A lot of times people talk about the US efforts in the American Revolution and they go, it's just a bunch of militia, there was no formal army. What do you think George Washington was in charge of? He's not the president. We don't have one of those yet. So we absolutely have a formal army and they wear uniforms, and part of that's symbolic. I mean, this is a symbol of the new nation. So people saw that as important. So Washington will lead the formal army and they'll work together with colonial or what becomes state militias to fight the war. Also, stuff that's important that you want to mention potentially in your answer. You might talk about Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which was to people who were enslaved, if they fought on the side of the British, they would gain their freedom. So there'll be some similar provisions made for people to earn their liberty by fighting in the American militias or the formal army. So you'll see a little bit of that happen in response to Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Also, you might mention common sense, which is the Thomas Paine document that argued that it's time for everyone to unify behind the cause of liberty. One thing that seemed to be true, even as we were fighting and declaring independence, which is coming like a year and a half after we started fighting, was that not everybody agreed with the war. Some, especially people in more loyalist states, people who are plantation owners, not super excited about a revolution that proclaims liberty. So not everybody's behind the cause. So common sense is supposed to argue that England is a royal brute, that it's an unnatural mother that devours its young, that all of nature cries 'tis time to part. It's absurd that an island would rule a continent. So it's supposed to be a logical treatise to convince, in some ways, the common man, the guy who probably doesn't have as much to gain from independence, that the philosophy of independence will be beneficial to them as well, and that it's time to do this. So the idea behind common sense is to get the common man to join in. And it's a fairly successful piece of propaganda, for sure. Thomas Paine's ideas really are reflections of Enlightenment ideas and maybe recreations of other things that people have said. He also wrote in a very clear and direct way, so it's not, overly philosophical. The vocabulary is well chosen. So the idea really was to persuade the common man. And a lot of times people went and read these in taverns, or read this in taverns and things like that. When we do declare independence, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence understood that by doing this, that they were pledging their lives and their sacred honor, and they really meant their lives. They understood, like in Bacon's Rebellion, that if you sign the document, if the war doesn't go well, you're going to be the first folks they execute. All right, there's a whole bunch more stuff here and not a whole bunch more time. So let me just kind of look at, this is probably why I made a list of stuff instead of really formal notes. John Adams recommended George Washington because they saw him, as being from a middle colony, the Chesapeake region, as having the potential to unify the northern and southern colonies. Plus, he had military experience. Plus, he seemed to be the guy that everybody kind of agreed was that noble fellow who was selfless and would represent the entire group well and make decisions that were not I don't want to say partisan because they don't have parties yet, but were not in his own self-interest. They saw him as an unusually gifted leader, an unusually selfless leader, and he had some military experience as well that was going to be helpful. So most people agreed with this. Yeah. Washington's fighting strategy is slightly different than the traditional European strategy. Traditional European strategy was kind of all in, frontal attack, no retreat. Washington knew he had very limited resources, as far as weapons and soldiers. So if things were not going well, they retreated. They did. Their policy was kind of live to fight another day. And they didn't just, they did do some traditional fighting where, you have the different lines and you took turns shooting at each other. But they also did some of the hide behind the trees or, wait until people got closer to shoot at them, to not waste bullets, that sort of thing. So they did adapt their fighting styles to that of fighting styles that had developed with fights with Native Americans. Oh, sorry for the yawn. You see that much more with militia. They're much less formal. However, you see that with the formal military as well for the United States. Washington was willing to retreat, which European commanders saw as cowardly and Washington saw as strategic. The purpose and text of the Declaration of Independence, of course, the Declaration of Independence was to declare independence. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but it's written by Thomas Jefferson to argue that natural rights really kind of require this social contract that England is not living up to, and that England is not protecting life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness or property in the way that they're supposed to. So, if nature's law and nature's God gives us these rights, our rights are not given to us by the government. They're not given to us by the British military or by the British Constitution. It is a natural right of every person to have freedom. Now, they're going to recognize in this process that when they say it's the natural right of everyone to have freedom, that there might be some fairly obvious contradictions, even in the Americas, where they're longing for freedom. But they're going to argue that England has violated the social contract to protect life, liberty, and property because they are also not providing representation. And they're very purposeful in seeing that their revolution might perhaps inspire other people to come to the Americas to see this as an asylum for all people who seek freedom, that sort of thing. And it will lead to other declarations of independence that occur in the Western Hemisphere and throughout the world. And that part of the book, I think, is really interesting as well. It's also why I know students, well, who doesn't have a hard time with this, sometimes get upset with founding fathers who declare freedom, independence, liberty, that kind of stuff, but own slaves. And, it is a problem. There's no doubt about it. But even this Declaration of Rights and then eventually a Bill of Rights, that sort of thing, will lead to legal foundations for the expansion of people's rights. So it's not perfect. It's not even close to perfect, but it leads to this sort of continual improvement, what they'll refer to later on as perfection, perfectionism, the idea of always getting better. So becoming more like the promise of our founding documents. So you'll see lots of discussion of that. The book's super specific about things that Washington did and his leadership, why we were able to win this victory. I would suggest to you that when you're answering the weekly question that you talk about Saratoga. Battle of Saratoga is pretty crucial stuff because it leads to, it leads to the French, I know the Spanish as well, but it leads to the French siding with the United States in the war. part of what the Americans, the United States wanted to do was to get foreign allies against the British. And nobody's going to do that at the beginning of the war because there's no chance that the United States can win. And they lose most of their their battles at the beginning of the war. They do. But once they win at Saratoga, this kicks the army out of the northern part of the colonies. It kicks the British army out because the British army is captured. So they surrender, and then they have to leave. So that consolidates the fighting. And the French go, you know what? Maybe they can win this thing. So the French will ally with the United States. And I know we tend to denigrate the French. It's sort of rude, isn't it? But they were a world power during this era. And once the French join, they're going to send over troops and the Marquis de Lafayette, who will work in hand with George Washington. And they're also going to send over ships. Yeah, ships. And we don't have much of a navy. So the French is very helpful, very, very helpful. So French, the friendships will also, the Navy will help, even if they're not super helpful, maybe at developing blockades along the coast, they are certainly really good at harassing British ships on the ocean, and that's a distraction. Also, another distraction is the potential of fighting across the English Channel. So then the English aren't as willing to commit all of their troops to this American conflict. They're going to keep some home in reserve. So it decreases the ability of the English to fight a total war because they want to leave some troops at home to protect the homeland, just on the off chance that France gets a little frisky and says, you know what, we're going to attack you at home as well. I'm going to scroll down in the notes. I don't know if you've noticed this. Weird notes. Who made these notes? At least the chapter 8 notes are good. I'll try to see if I can work on this a little bit before I see you next time. But if you look at the bottom of the notes, I don't know if you've noticed this, there's a little list of stuff as well. Stuff that maybe led to some advantages. The ocean. Yeah, distance is an enormous problem and an expensive problem for England to overcome. The French, after the Battle of Saratoga, the British, they have a lot of advantages: better weapons, bigger military, stronger navy, more military training and experience. A better cause, that's definitely the US. I didn't really note that in the notes, but that is definitely the US. The English are fighting to stop the pesky colonists from rebelling. The English are fighting for their own individual freedom, to gain wealth, for cause, to protect their families, that sort of stuff. These British soldiers, they didn't bring their families with them, of course. So they're fighting a foreign war, and they're not defending, the family that they can physically see. The American troops are less likely to feel confined by traditional fighting techniques, more likely to use guerrilla warfare. I would just point out to you that that's how you spell guerrilla. Just, it's not the animal, but it's guerrilla, like, Spanish war. And then Washington also really wants to build camaraderie and morale with his troops. So he stays with them even, in the snowpocalypse that was Valley Forge. We, at least now, we can kind of relate to that a little bit, where it's really cold and there's no luxury and you have to melt snow to flush the toilet. Okay, they didn't really, but he stuck it out with them rather than like that crazy Burgoyne, General Burgoyne, who makes his troops stay in tents and then steals people's mansions and stays in them. So Washington builds a lot of respect and a lot of loyalty, which is going to be helpful, especially in eras where the troops aren't getting paid, or they're getting paid with money that is worthless. So, Washington and his wife will come to Valley Forge and help feed the troops and that sort of stuff. Washington inspires a lot of personal loyalty as well. And the US had this flexibility of using the regular army plus militia. So they would have the regular army that could go to major battles, but then they would have local troops that could help as well. All right. Good. I haven't talked that long in weeks, have I? You haven't listened that much in weeks. Did you listen today? Are you listening? Okay. So, long story short, thanks for listening. Thanks for the thumbs up. I appreciate it. I'm glad you're with me. Um, Long story short, the Americans do end up winning. And we can talk more, a little bit more about the revolution if you like, next time, the battles and stuff like that. However, you may want to try to work on the weekly question. At the end of the notes, you noticed I just scrolled down, there's a list. Also, there's a separate video that I made just about the weekly question. There's a ton of stuff in the book. I think you guys will be okay on this one. I'm going to stop the recording.